Oil companies, OPEC, Saudis, not exactly eager to make sure prices are low before an election where Democratic candidates are vulnerable. It's also why Saudi Arabia might want to suddenly announce a cut in oil production right before the midterms. Of course, Democrats can't just throw their hands up and say, oh, well, because the future of American democracy is in, as we report night in, night out on this program, real peril, existential peril.
I don't know how much we could.
One of the two major parties is currently under the thrall of the guy who tried a violent coup unsuccessfully, but has basically announced he'd do it all over again. By one analysis, 60% of Americans will have an election denier on their ballot this November.
I'll stop it there to save us all the gag reflex that would result from watching this 2 minutes of hate. I mean, it is literally Orwellian 2 minutes of hate coming out of Chris Hayes. And anybody watching that, do you not get the impression that Chris Hayes, by demeanor and by overall presentation, is trying to mimic Tucker Carlson? I'm noticing a distinct attempt to replicate the Tucker delivery, the Tucker formulation, the Tucker demeanor. He's just, he's just got one problem. He's nowhere near as smart as Tucker Carlson, and he's spewing propaganda points out. So I wanted to start with that because I couldn't really think of. I was going to start with a Neil Oliver clip, but we're going to have about 90 minutes of Neil Oliver real time. So I didn't want to spoil the surprise there. I was going to start with Justin Trudeau, but I think I've punished the audience enough this week with Justin Trudeau clips. Today is going to be amazing. This is like one of those moments where the first time I met Robert Barnes online, because of what we had both been doing in the world, it turned into an amazing relationship. But it was also just like, it was a spiritually satisfying moment for me when I did that first stream with Robert Barnes, Nate Brody, and now it's Neil Oliver, who I only got to know because of the madness of the world through which we are all collectively living. I listened to Neil speak. I call it intellectual poetry. He puts into words what I know people feel, but some lack the words or ability to put into the words themselves. And we've connected, and now he's going to be here today. I told him I was going to let everyone trickle in at the early part of the stream, do my intro, do my promo, because I got to thank the sponsors now who have had the courage to sponsor a channel that engages in wrongthink, that engages in asking questions that apparently we're not allowed asking anymore. The small fringe minority with unacceptable views. And we're going to be talking a lot about the madness and the destruction that has been going on for the last 2.5 years of our collective lives, which is a good segue into staying healthy and being healthy and thanking the sponsor of this particular stream, Field of Greens. Everybody, you're supposed to eat vegetables 5 to 6 servings a day. Not everybody can do it. Most people can. If you can't, the next best thing, Field of Greens, it's not a supplement. It's not an extract. It is desiccated, pulverized vegetables. It's actually basically just pulverized vegetables. You get antioxidants. You get the health that you need from vegetables for those who don't necessarily have the healthiest diets. 1 spoonful, 1 serving, morning, evening. It doesn't taste bad. It does not taste bad, I promise you. It actually tastes good. And if you can't get your veggies in, do it. It's healthy. If you can't get your veggies in, do it. It's healthy. Fieldofgreens.com. If you go there, promo code Viva, it's Viva, not Viva Frei. Promo code Viva, 15% off your first order, 10% off the subscription, and it's good stuff. Appreciate USDA approved. Organic, it's food. It's not a supplement. It's not an extract. Made in America, and it's damn good. As everyone continues to trickle in. Oh, the link is in the description as well. As everyone continues to trickle in. Neil Oliver, historian. And I did not know this. I only knew Neil Oliver as another individual engaging in ostensible wrongthink at a time where you're not allowed asking certain questions. You're not allowed saying certain things. I had no idea he was a historian, an archaeologist, an author, a documentarian, and that explains why he is able to so eloquently put into words what so many of us have, storming around our heads. I like to see my vegetables. This is true. Random roses. And you should not avoid eating vegetables and substitute it. But not everybody can eat their vegetables. When I was in Texas, I couldn't find vegetables. I couldn't find vegetables. No judgment on Texas. It was just circumstance. So Field of Greens, it's a spoon full of powdered vegetables. Nutrients, antioxidants, healthy. Okay, but that's it. We're done with that. It's 5 minutes in. Neil is in the backdrop. In the UK, 5-hour difference. Tough to coordinate, and we did it. Neil, I can see you. I'm bringing you in right now. Everybody, the man of the hour, Neil Oliver. Neil, how are you doing?
It's lovely to see you. I'm doing fine. I was just enjoying listening to all of that, and I'm delighted, as you say, that we've been able to hook up, and I'm looking forward to a free-flowing, no-holds-barred conversation.
It's a digital hookup, an intellectual hookup. Neil, okay, so I like to delve into people's childhoods. But before we even get there, for those who don't know who you are, I think I've given the 30,000-foot overview, but give us the elevator pitch, and then we're diving into your childhood.
As you say, I began really in my adult career as an archaeologist. I studied at Glasgow University. I worked as a freelance excavator for a few years. Struggling to make it financially viable, I jumped ship and retrained as a journalist. I worked in newspapers, qualified as a journalist, worked in local weekly papers in a couple of places around Scotland. I then worked, believe it or not, I was an internet webmaster for BT.com, which is the third website that was ever built in Britain in the mid-90s. So I had a history with early internet. Then I stumbled into television, making archaeological documentaries, historical documentaries. And there I was for a happy couple of decades, really, making quite light, cheerful, I think interesting documentaries about the past. And then all of this started to unfold: lockdown, COVID, and the rest of the nonsense. I found myself with a platform. First of all, I was being interviewed weekly on a talk radio station here in the UK. Then I was approached by a fledgling TV channel called GB News, who signed me up from the beginning. And I do a weekly show on GB News, where I've had the great good fortune to be able to vent spleen and give my opinion about what's going on, and to talk to people from across the spectrum about all that's going on. I consider myself to be, I'm not a specialist, I'm not a politician, I've never been a card-carrying member of a political party. I treat politics and politicians with deep skepticism and suspicion. I'm just a reasonable person, I think, insisting on being able to ask reasonable questions and get factual answers back. And until the last breath in my body, I will continue so to do.
Fantastic. Well, okay, we're going to flesh out probably all of those individual chapters of what you just said. But born and raised, where are you born and raised? You're Scottish, but I know I've seen a few interviews. You consider yourself British.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I was born in a town called Renfrew, which is on the other side of the River Clyde from Glasgow, which maybe makes it easier for people to visualise in Scotland. Mostly grew up down in the southwest in a place called Dumfries, near the English border. I've lived most of my life in Scotland. Work has taken me all over the UK and all over the world. You're right. I consider myself to be, and it was never a political thing, I consider myself to be British. When I was a kid, if you were on holiday in Europe or whatever, someone asked you where you were from, I was likely just to say I was from Britain or that I was British. And then if people asked more specific questions, as you just did, I would say where I was born, which is Scotland. But for me, I always felt being part of the bigger family of the countries of the British Isles was much more interesting, much more fun, and I continue to be. I came to some prominence in 2014 when there was a referendum about Scottish independence. For me, it was never about Scottish independence, but that's a whole other story. I don't think that's really what was on offer. Nonetheless, I spoke up and said that I thought it was a better idea to remain part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And that threw me into a bit of a spotlight. But until the end, I will consider myself to be a British Scot.
And I didn't mean it in a political sense or a judgmental sense. I was listening to a few interviews and trying to analogize it to life in Quebec, where if you're a French Canadian, French Quebecer, and you don't support the separation of Quebec, sometimes people tend to view you as kissing the butt of the English or not being a true Frenchman. And so I imagine it's a similar sort of
very much so. Okay. It's very much like that. It's for those that are blood and soil nationalists who want secession. Anything short of shouting from the battlements about independence is high treason. There's no middle ground. If you're not in that camp, then you're the enemy. And a Scot, a born Scot, who prefers the Union is the worst of all worlds for the blood and soil nationalists. That carries a charge of treason with it, by definition. And so it's always been very difficult since 2014 to articulate a position of being of loving Scotland while simultaneously loving England, Ireland, and Wales. And I know Ireland, north and south. There's the Republic, and then there's the North, which is part of the United Kingdom. But I love the island of Ireland, north and south. And for me, I've always the analogy I've tried to use to express my feeling is that for me, having been born and raised feeling part of Britain, to have that all cut away, I think I would feel like one of these old soldiers that 60 years after they lose a limb, they're still scratching for that phantom missing leg. I think that's how I would feel if I was suddenly cut off from my sense of belonging to the bigger place.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating. I was, whenever I have a guest, I try to look for scandals, and this was the most scandalous thing I found on you, was the controversy, because I thought you had a Scottish accent, and we don't fully appreciate the nuance, the Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland issue, Scotland, England thing. But now I can imagine it's totally analogous and understand why it might have been controversial at the time. To be one of the French Canadians saying we should stay part of Canada, to be one of the born Scots saying we should remain part of the UK. But we might get back to that in a bit. Childhood. I was trying to find things out, and I don't know.
Ask me anything you like.
Well, I just want to take a guess. Were you an only child?
No, I've got two big sisters who both still live in Scotland. My mum is still alive. I lost my dad. My dad died a couple of years ago now. And I had a very typical, I would say, a working class Scottish British childhood. Grew up. My dad worked. My mum worked part-time sometimes. I went to state school. Just an ordinary schools. I had a very normal, happy childhood. Unremarkable, I would have said it in most ways. The kind of childhood that 60-70% of people born and raised in Scotland in the 60s and 70s would recognise and identify with. Just a happy, regular childhood. I was the only member of my family, or the only one of my siblings, to go to university. If you were to ask me why, I don't really know why. It's just the way things worked out, and so I went off to Glasgow University and decided to study archaeology, as I mentioned at the top of the show. But unremarkable. That's just. I think I'm a typical Scot, a typical working class Brit.
And if I may ask, did your dad pass away during COVID or before?
Well, nearly 2 years ago now. So just as it was, just as the whole thing was starting to take shape, my dad had been he'd been ill for a while. He died of cancer, but he had been ill and diagnosed for quite a long time. But he hung on in there for quite a while, and the end came relatively quickly, I suppose. So no, he didn't. I mean, my mum was up visiting with me. She was up seeing me and the family yesterday from down home in Dumfries, and she was saying, "I wonder what your dad would have made of all of this these last 2 years." My dad, in some respects, I wish he was still here, but he hasn't had to come through this, the COVID paranoia, the lockdowns, the dereliction of duty on the part of the ruling class, the gross removal of basic rights, right to travel, freedoms, coercion around vaccines and the rest of it, and the economic hit. The Dumfries, the town of Dumfries that we moved into, gosh, how long ago now? 40 odd years ago, 50 years ago, is completely changed now. It's been hit very badly economically. And it's been very, very badly hit in the aftermath of the cost of lockdown crisis. So I think about him every day, but in some respects, I do think I'm glad he's not seeing this.
Did if I may ask, were you able to mourn properly, like have a proper funeral?
Well, we did have a funeral. I was able to attend his funeral with my mum, one of my sisters, and my wife Trudy, and our kids came down. We went down to Dumfries for it. It was very low key though. There was nobody else at the service. But to be honest, my mum and dad were very quite private people. You know, it would have been uncharacteristic for them to do anything, you know, large scale or ostentatious. There hasn't been that element to their characters throughout my life. So it was a very quiet, intimate goodbye.
And now, childhood, say unspectacular or just, you know, relatively normal. But what does a childhood in Dumfries look like? Is it countryside running around, or is it?
Dumfries would characterise itself traditionally as a market town. It's in the southwest of Scotland, as I say, about 20 odd miles, nearly 30 miles from the English border. It's set in soft rural landscape. Gentle rolling hills and woodland and rivers, and for the longest time, the people there made their living from farming. And Dumfries was a principal town, you know, sitting at a nexus of roads, and traditionally it was where people would have brought animals, you know, for sale and trade, and so it was it was a market town that we moved into in the early 1970s as a family. And a population then, as now, of, I suppose, around 30,000 people. Maybe, I don't know, actually. I haven't looked at the figures for Dumfries for a lot of years. That kind of scale, though. A few primary schools, a few high schools. There was a little bit of industry, but all of the industry's gone now. Dumfries has been very badly hit by, you know, at the moment you would say it's a place of low-paid employment where there is employment. There's a little bit of tourism because of the scenery, the local scenery, but there's no industry anymore. And the farming market town aspect of it has also diminished in recent years. So it's become something of a backwater, I would say. It was bypassed by a major road. There was a major trunk road motorway put in to, rather than passing through the town, it left it in a kind of an oxbow lake, kind of a, you know, left as a backwater. But it was a happy childhood. I did perfectly well at school. I was probably in the top half of any given class, but unremarkable. I wasn't ever interested. I certainly didn't excel at any kind of sport. Yeah, I mean, I lived a life below the radar really for most of my life. When I became an archaeologist and so on, and I worked in newspapers. When I stumbled into television, and it literally was accidental. I just was. I think, as many people who find themselves making documentary television, I was in the right place at the right time to get a tap on the shoulder to see if I would. It was initially a television series about battlefield archaeology, which came out of the fact that with a friend, we had set up an excavation at the battlefield of Isandlwana in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. People who've seen the film Zulu, Michael Caine, Stanley Baker, that war between Victoria's red-coated soldiers and the Zulu nation had been a fascination for myself and a friend, and we set up a project in the late 90s, early 2000s to go out and excavate the battlefield, and it attracted the attention of television. And so I was in my early 30s, I was about 30, 31, when suddenly I was on television and suddenly exposed to that kind of, you know, people looking at me. And it was certainly never anything that I had intended. I never sought the spotlight. And so what has happened to me in the last few years of becoming increasingly controversial, I suppose, notorious even, and being characterized as all sorts of right-wing, tin hat wearing, swivel-eyed lunatic extremist, has been a very, well, unexpected certainly, but also undeniably uncomfortable experience, because it's not anything I ever set out to do.
It is. I mean, look, the first thing is watching your demeanor and now knowing your childhood. I was like, there are certain people you say, if they were any different in real life, I would be shocked. And looking at your demeanor, it's not something someone can do by accident or by practice. It just has to be innate. And it now fits in what you describe as your childhood and your reaction to, I've seen the way you're characterized. In fact, when people started sending me the first clips that I saw of you, I saw the context in which you were being described, and I was like, oh, I knew how media worked. I was like, oh, another one of these, and now I know so much better. But so actually, just that you studied archaeology in university.
Glasgow University, yes.
Did you always have an interest in history and the world?
Yeah, at school, if I had my best subjects, I suppose, would be English and history. I was my mum and dad were big readers. The house was full of books, novels, so fiction and non-fiction, and so there was a lot of books. There were a lot of books around, so I read. So English was a natural fit for me. I loved storytelling. I loved writing stories. I loved reading stories. I loved language. I loved the cadences and rhythms of the spoken word and the written word. History, and I was drawn to history because to me, I think it's really storytelling of the sort that will go back to a time beyond the reach of memory. I would have thought when people were sat around the campfires of the hunting world tens of thousands of years ago, effectively what they would have been telling each other and spinning stories about would be some kind of history. They'd be telling the story of the family, the story of the tribe, which by any other name would be history of a sort. And so it was the storytelling that always attracted me to history. You very kindly introduced me as a historian. I can't claim to be a historian because I don't have a degree. I don't have any academic qualification in history. I am an archaeologist, but I'm a lover of history. I'm an enthusiast about it. And when I got the chance to go to university, when I realised that my exam passes were going to let me do that, I latched on to archaeology because it seemed to me an opportunity to get back to the story of humankind from as close as I was going to get to page one. I've always been interested personally in where my family came from. I learned very early on that both of my grandfathers had fought in and survived the First World War, and my mum's dad died long before I was born, but he carried wounds from Gallipoli until the end of his life. And my dad's dad was at the Somme and Passchendaele, and he was wounded and carried shrapnel in his arm and behind one ear. So I was from a very young age, I was very aware of the fact that both of these men had taken part in something as enormous, as planet changing as the Great War. And that fed and led into a fascination with me about what the rest of my family's story was, how we fitted in. Why did we live in Dumfries? What had brought that bit of my family to there when my grandparents lived in Glasgow? All of that just piqued my curiosity. And so that was what pulled me into being interested in history, and archaeology seemed to me the way to get back to the beginning, because it also occurred to me, very early on that, like everybody else, I must have ancestors who saw the Romans, ancestors who were there with the first farmers and people building stone circles and the great burial tombs. And I also must have ancestors who were amongst the hunter-gatherers that walked dry shod into what became the British Isles 15,000 years ago. I thought, I'm connected to all of those stories, and archaeology seemed to me the path leading as far back as I could hopefully get, as close as I was going to get to a time machine to find out more about where my people had come from. And I can honestly say, when I began studying archaeology, it was like one of those moments in the cartoons, where the love hearts, pink, and the rainbow and everything appears above, the focus of your adoration. I just loved it. I just loved everything about archaeology. I loved the stories. I loved the fact that we spent the summers away from university on digs, taking part in excavations, actually physically finding things, touching things from thousands of years ago. I just loved it. And, at that time in my life, my early 20s, I thought I was going to spend my life as an archaeologist. But financially, it was just it's a non-starter. I woke up one morning, I had been excavating a bit of Roman road in the winter. Digging in the winter is a lot different than digging in the summer. And I woke up one morning, I was probably about, I don't know, it was my mid-20s, and I thought, one day I'm going to be 40, and I'm going to be arthritic from working in the cold and the rain, and I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a house. And it was with that realization that I jumped ship, as I say, and I got the opportunity to join a weekly newspaper and retrain as a journalist, because I thought, well, it's got writing, it's all about writing, and journalism is digging. The same curiosity that makes me wonder what people were doing 10,000 years ago makes me curious about why people did what they did yesterday. So that archaeology and journalism are both driven by nosiness. I'm nosy about and curious about and fascinated by what people do and why and where they do it and what are the consequences. And so journalism seemed a fairly logical opportunity step for me.
I'm just saying, I love you put into words what people can only, in retrospect, appreciate were emotions in their mind. The idea of digging in journalism is no different than digging in the ground for archaeological finds to understand the past and the present.
Yeah, I'm just nosy. There's an undeniable magic though about archaeology that's meant that archaeology has always, I drifted in and out of it. You know, it was like a first love that I became, from whom I became estranged, and then almost as though the universe was determined that we meet again. And so I circled all the way back round to making television programs about archaeology. It was as though I couldn't escape the gravitational pull of it, and it is all down to the magic of being able to, if you're on an excavation and you find, say, the remains of a campfire, and you can find the remains of a campfire from 10,000 years ago, but charcoal, fire-cracked stones, and so you can find that in the landscape somewhere, and with absolute certainty what people were doing when they were looking at it. When they were there, it was a fire, and they were warming themselves, or keeping wild animals at bay, or they were cooking, or whatever. But what they were doing, and also in your head that you're separated from them by, say, whatever, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, but that diaphanous separation seems very slight, because you've got that human connection, because we like fire, they used fire. You've got that direct connection to them, and you put your hand down on things that they touched, and I find that a profoundly moving experience. I always have, and as I talk about certain things, it always puts the hairs up on the back of my neck, because I find that ability that archaeology provides to reach back as much as you can and touch things from distant past is profound.
What we're going to do now, it's a good time, because the next question is going to be a whole new subject. Everyone, let's move it over to Rumble, because we're going to dive into how Neil became a boogeyman of sorts, just by digging, just by asking. And I got a bunch of questions to get there. So everybody, we're going to wind it up on YouTube, move over to Rumble, and I'll give everyone 30 seconds to do it right now.